Welcome. Welcome, everyone. It's Angelo Robles. For those of you live, sorry, started a little bit late, a little bit of technical difficulties. We hope it will hold up. And we have a great show for you today, Swimming in Different Water, a first principles. You know, I love first principles, a first principles view of the system that nobody sees. And this is really going to be a discussion about power through technology, energy, money, and really kind of a battle for global order with someone who's a technologist, an investor at heart, and someone who really understands the things we're going to talk about from a unique perspective. So we have a very special guest joining us today. We're very excited to have him, and that would be Ryan Mahon. He's the founder of AquaVis Advisors, co-founder of CrowdCent, an investor and first principles thinker with deep expertise across semiconductors, technology, and investment management. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Angelo, and appreciate the hat. I'm honored.
You know you're a special guest when I have my lovely black cowboy hat on, so we greatly appreciate you. Thank you for your kind words, I hope. And on that note, we have so much to cover, and the audience likes to get right to it. Without further ado, we are going to jump right into, well, the swimming in different waters, or I could say deep waters. So here we go. So you kind of say when we connected in my show notes that most people don't really realize the water they're swimming in has changed. What's actually different, my question to you, Ryan, about the global system right now versus really only 10 years ago? What are family offices missing, and what could they learn adapting to a new reality?
Yeah, it's a good question. And frankly, for most of history, you don't really need to pay much attention to the system itself. The system, the water you're swimming in, typically doesn't change very often. These are typically coinciding with hegemonic shifts. And so the last real system change was after World War II, when the US was the clear hegemon and dictated the world order. We can walk through how we got from there to today, but simplistically talking about how we've changed even over the last decade, what you've seen over really the last 10 to 20 years is the system continuing to perpetuate what it had been set out to do at its start, which was effectively to ship US production overseas, which initially started with Germany and Japan after World War II, progressed to Korea, Taiwan, and more recently China, and increase US consumption. And all the while, the US dollar was sitting at the center as the world reserve currency, and then progressively, the world reserve asset shifted towards U.S. treasuries among other U.S. assets. But long story short, that system basically stopped serving the architect. So the original architect was the U.S. coming out of World War II. Call it about 20, 25 years ago. And yet we continued to perpetuate that system as well as the policies on top of it. And so much so that the system shifted where it was undermining the architect, and it became a national security concern. So it was really exposed during COVID, when to get things like masks or pharmaceuticals or even semiconductors, it became a clear issue that the US was dependent upon external sources for those key critical products, I'd call them. And what we've seen over the last year really is the Trump administration basically saying these pendulums have swung too far. Capital over labor, the old over the young, the consumption in the US over production, and tariffs were kind of that wake-up call. And in parallel, they've been building out a new system. And so the old system, kind of the part of the reason for tariffs was to wake up the world to say, hey, the old system does not work, and it does not work for the architect. It might empower adversaries of the US like China. And we're going to restructure and build something new. Let's come to the table. And so that's when I'm talking about the system and the water you're swimming in. That's what I'm referring to. And we see all of these things in a lot of downstream outputs. So most people are talking just about the symptoms, like wealth concentration and things like that. But those are just outputs of foundational system decisions, as well as the policies that sit on top.
There's a lot of nuances in terms of what you said, going back to after World War II, that would put us into Bretton Woods. The
Yep.
US dollar is king. 1971 comes along. Oops. Not backed by a hard asset like gold anymore. And really all countries effectively take it into effect. Low interest rates, GDP growth, incredible, especially in the 50s and 60s, but grave challenges ahead. So we could argue the old system was applicable at that point in time.
Absolutely.
Trade imbalances with the US, well, it brings down our cost, lower cost for Americans, low interest rates. There's a whole bunch of factors that you effectively very much mentioned. But we're not in that world now. We're not in where the US's only adversary effectively of scale was the old Soviet Union. You're a little bit young, but of course, you know history very well. And now you're correct. It definitely, China's a very, very worthy and likely equal on many fronts adversary. And we could argue it's not even really a dual hegemony. Really, it's arguably multiple, although US and China are definitely towards the top. So walk us through your core thesis and why big investors and family offices should care of why the old system is ending and what does that actually mean for the markets and investors. I grew up in an era when, with some exceptions, the stock market it had tailwinds behind it. It was doing great. That's not a guarantee it's going to do that moving forward. Like you said, relative to manufacturing, we outsourced a lot of that knowledge work here in the US. Now AI is going to disrupt that. So I would state, you noted COVID. I'm going to throw in AI and the rise of China. So what could families do understanding the old system is ending? And what does that actually mean for the market and investors?
Yeah, so I guess a couple things on that. So the old system, to your point, worked as intended, and its purpose basically brought a golden age to the US, I would argue, in the 90s when they still had critical product production of technology, semiconductors at that point, which was an asymmetric technology. They had effectively energy independence, though that could be argued one way or the other there. And money was still growing roughly in line with the labor force. So the money that was being created was put to productive use. What started to shift from 2000 and on is the money that was printed, particularly after 2008 as well as 2020, was not put to particularly productive uses. It was used to inflate capital rather than invest in productive labor force, like the growing, I guess, Gen X and then millennials, or industrial production, things that are typically higher multiplier. Whereas after 2000, basically, capital was printed and majority of that went back into financial assets, which effectively increased the actual admission ticket to enter the system itself for the productive labor force. Point being is this old system served consumption, and it was a very clear one-way street where you want to invest in U.S. financial assets, ideally things focused on U.S. consumption. There's basically a one-way train from interest rates going down in the 1980s through 2020, and that as that system shifts towards a new system, you need to understand that this is no longer linearly tweaking. This is no longer, the Fed cutting by 25 basis points or not. This is a shift in the underlying rules of the world as well as the policies on top of that, and what are they likely to promote. And in my view, it's going to shift that pendulum that shifted too far towards consumption back towards production, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. And I think a lot of the Trump agenda is deeply focused on that, whether it's Venezuela, Greenland, the AI productive capacity build out in the US, the TSMC reshoring into the US. All of this is to basically rebuild the strength of the pillars of power, which maybe that's a good segue to even talk about some of those. But if the last, call it 80 years, was focused on investing in consumption in the Western Hemisphere, I think the next decade plus, if not longer, is going to be focused on production, and particularly production of critical products. When I say critical products, I mean things that go into technology to give you that asymmetric advantage, because military power really comes downstream of your technological power. Most innovations on the technology front actually started historically in the military. So if you look at the semiconductor or the internet, those were darkly incubated and then commercialized on the consumer side. AI is a little different. It actually kind of started in tandem. It certainly was being worked on from a military perspective, but it commercialized very quickly from a consumer perspective. But the confluence of all of these cycles, I pay attention to a lot of the different cycles, from Neil Howe's demographics to Ray Dalio's long-term debt cycle to Carlota Perez's technological revolutions in financial capital. And the point in bringing those up is basically all of them are converging now, where there are asymmetric shifts in all of them, where from a demographic perspective, the younger generation like millennials and Gen X are rising in terms of power position. From a debt perspective, we're clearly at a constrained position for the hegemon with 130% debt to GDP. And from a tech perspective, you mentioned AI, you also talk about blockchain, but broader point being there are fundamental shifts that are occurring that are going to dramatically transform what the system looks like in 10 years and the purpose of that system. It will no longer be to focus on offshoring production and boosting US consumption. It'll look different, in my view. It'll be similar to the US Middle East deal from last year, where rather than the US focusing on having the Middle East invest in financial assets with their excess surplus, they said, okay, here's the exchange. Technology, you can build on the US technology stack. We suppress energy prices, which theoretically can work from the perspective of holding down inflation as gets built out. And from a money perspective, rather than recycling that capital back into unproductive assets like financial assets with low multipliers, we're focusing on funneling that into physical infrastructure, physical productive infrastructure, AI data centers, and the related infrastructure to power it. And so when I'm thinking about kind of the high level in my process and what family offices should be paying attention to is if for the last 80 years, this was kind of the water you were swimming in, the next 80 years is going to look different. And if you're thinking about decades, I would think about productive capacity in the Western Hemisphere. I would think about, gold and gold mining in the Western Hemisphere, energy and energy production kind of in the Western Hemisphere as the US hegemon, in my view, is kind of refocusing internally to rebuild strength before kind of projecting power again.
You talk about rebuilding strength, and you mentioned Ray Dalio's debt cycle. We're near, like you said, 130% GDP. Really, only Japan has been able to kind of make that work. That usually doesn't end good. We have massive debt. We have a significant deficit. We have tons of internal strife in the country and in the West, and it feels like around the world, multiple countries is at 9 with nuclear weapons. And again, the rise of AI that could displace a lot of people. Obviously, the world does appear very different now, even than it was, I would state, even a year or two ago. You mentioned family offices need to perhaps think a little differently. A lot of them have been successful. A lot of people that are executives are in their 40s, 50s, or 60s. They're well-meaning, they're classically educated, and broadly speaking, on the investing front and mitigating risk, let's go with they've done a good job. But they've done it, like you hinted, with an economy and really a world that no longer exists. Things are changing. What would you say? And family offices are not known for often being quick to change. Where or what are people on the old side of the geopolitical picture, the hegemony, the macro environment, investing, getting wrong? And how do they need to think? And this may segue into first principles thinking to adapt to a new world.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the way I break it out is kind of the old system, which again is that post-World War II system, which did change non-linearly, to your point, kind of in 1971 with the dropping of the gold as of the reserve asset. and the new system, which I would argue is still emerging, and we can talk more about it. And I wouldn't necessarily say one is right and one is wrong. It's just the conditions in which one functions to serve a purpose need to adapt. And I think the point of people in power, I think they got to get three big things right, in my view. So if you're in power as in power with the hegemon, so basically like U.S. politicians or people of institutional power from that perspective, the three things that I think they need to get right are: one, always just take a step back and say, is the system still functioning, and is it functioning towards the purpose that we want? Two, are our pillars of power being invested in and strengthened? Because the pillars of power themselves give you the control over the system. And three, are we actively investing in the productive labor force and productive capital allocation? Because that is kind of what determines both your near-term productivity as well as your long-term output. And the reason I bring those things up is thinking about it from that mindset as well also allows you to, as a family office, to say, okay, if the old system wasn't working and it started to undermine the architect and things are going to change, how might they change it to answer those questions to improve it going forward? Because in general, you want to be aligned with where the big money is focused. And there's not much bigger money than the sovereigns. And so right now it's basically, are you investing in the US and Western Hemisphere ecosystem, as well as, Europe is still clearly aligned, and Australia, even though obviously there are spats from those perspectives. But the broader point being is, like, with that mindset, you can kind of drill down into areas that might be of critical importance as you move forward. And the way I like to think about it is, like I said, with the pillars of power framework, which any hegemon has its power downstream of those three pillars, which are technology, energy, and money. Technology, from the perspective of asymmetric technology, provides deterrence. So if your technology is so much better than number two or on, they rarely will challenge you because they know that it was kind of, there's risk of being ended, basically. And the US has effectively had that for the last 80 years, but in the last decade, it's kind of dwindled a bit. And then you also need productive capacity to actually produce that technology. So in this case, we're probably talking more about like semiconductors as well as AI. So these are key themes to be paying attention to from the perspective of that whole supply chain. And then the energy to actually power that productive capacity to build the technology, which from the US's perspective, the US is energy independent. Right now, we're actually shipping or exporting excess oil elsewhere. And in my view, I think natural gas and nuclear are probably bridge energy sources that get us towards solar, which I think is a little bit further away in terms of mass scale, because you need better battery tech. And then money from the perspective of the hegemon, they dictate whether that's the US dollar or whatever currency. Prior to that would have been the pound. And in the place of transition, you want to be focused probably on precious metals like gold or silver, which can be debated whether that's money or not. As well as the downstream supply chains from that perspective, which would be, gold miners, silver miners, all of that energy productive capacity, as well as critical product productive capacity on the technology pillar side, which thinking about semiconductors as well as the progression of the AI cycle. What does it look like in 5 years? Are we overbuilding the infrastructure, and should you be focused on the layer above, which is probably AI applications? So long story short is when you're thinking about allocations, I actually use the pillars of power framework as a natural rebalancing portfolio. Technology, energy, and money. Money is kind of your debasement hedge. So you own gold, you can also own Bitcoin, from that perspective, depending upon kind of your risk tolerance. That's that in Dave Dredge terms. I don't know if you're familiar with him at Convexity, but those are kind of the brakes that allow you to actually go fast. And the asymmetric technology is kind of where you get that asymmetric convexity, where you can make your big bets on the future and what might be transformational and not just go up, a few X, but many 100X. And then energy is kind of that natural ballast where it tends to be cyclical supply demand, but there also are kind of nonlinear shifts along the way as you explore new energy sources, and those tend to coincide with technological revolutions. So like oil and the automobile, or steam and the coal and trains and so on.
Let's play a little bit of a game.
Yeah.
I'm on the board, the investment committee for several family offices. I'd like to think I'm forward thinking, maybe a little bit too much in the future when we're not quite there yet. My timelines, I'm not saying are perfect, but let's just assume we bring you in for a conversation with the investment committee. You have only a couple of minutes to make an impact. What you're hinting at now is the system has changed. We have a president that's doing things differently. Maybe you're not so quick to just rip up your investment policy statement, but maybe waiting a year or two before you adapt is going to be too long. I would be on board with that. You're mentioning things like commodities, silver, copper are going to be gravely needed for the internal components and build out of data center, solar, and technology. Ignore the fact that silver has been a little challenging after a massive run up in the very short term in the last week or so. So we're looking at energy, infrastructure, components behind the build out as you're describing. How do I would ask you, representing the committee, what's the biggest mistake that as a family office, without knowing too much of our detail, that we're likely making now, being slow to adapt? And what are some of the obvious pivot points? Meaning, if I'm going to put more money into what you're describing, it's either coming from cash or I'm taking it out of something that comes maybe at a tax cost and a complexity cost as well. What would you suggest that we do in terms of identifying the likely biggest mistake we're making and how some of our larger allocations now in public equities, in cash, and other holdings may need to be adapted?
Yeah. So I think because of how the old system was structured, particularly over the last 20 years, the policies that have been put into place, what you've seen is an over-concentration in the indices. Notably, the S&P and the Qs all have significant concentration in just a few names. And so likely family offices, if that's how they expressed those exposures to US assets, which also happen to be, I would argue, way over-owned from a foreign investor perspective. And I think that those flows are likely to shift as well with this new system shift. My view is starts to reduce the overly concentrated market cap weighted indice exposure and think about allocating it more thoughtfully. Even just doing equal weight would be smart relative to that, in my view. But also just thinking about all of those things I said, with productive capacity as kind of the overarching theme, and then filtering down through the pillars of power to find different opportunities within each, which, I mean, I spend a lot of time doing that, thinking about,
if I may,
Brazilian gold mines or things like that.
If I may push back a little bit, when you say equal weight, are you strictly talking about the more broad public markets? If so, my question would be, there's a lot of laggards, and a lot of them are going to get just, if not wiped out, gravely challenged by their slowness in AI and some of the new world order that we're describing here. Or are you more applicable to, they may have too much public equity exposure broadly, and they need to focus more on energy, infrastructure, and commodities? Which one, or both, and why?
Yeah. What I was referring to is just a simple shift from a market cap weighted S&P to an equal weighted would probably be better. I wouldn't recommend that. All I'm saying is that because you're basically making a bet on 10 names in an index, in a market cap weighted one, and many of those names are fundamentally changing their business structure shifting from capital light to capital heavy in an infrastructure boom that's, in my view, probably going to lead to a bust on the other end that'll be better for the actual consumers of AI, like the AI applications. So just that simple, with that simple knowledge, that is probably your source of capital. Thinking about what the world is going to look like, it probably will be multipolar. Right now, it's kind of the China tech stack versus the AI tech stack and where people are aligning, but paying attention to kind of the demographics around the world and where they might align. So like India still has powerful demographics. So if you still wanted to be consumption focused, I would focus more on a place like that. And whereas the other aspect of rebalancing towards energy infrastructure and physical productive assets, that would be, I would say, yes, an overarching thing more broadly. I think the market-weighted public equities are unlikely to be, in the US, are unlikely to be the best performing asset over the next decade as they were over really the past several decades.
And Ryan, I know it's not your core bailiwick being the CIO of an endowment or something like that, but I'm still going to ask you, staying on that theme, this question. Okay, let's even assume that I broadly agree. And how could you not see the tailwinds around infrastructure, energy, components of AI, and how things are changing? And maybe the public markets, or at least some of the stocks that are at the top of the list, may not be the best moving forward, or hedge my bets the best, if that's such a thing. But okay, so I should get more, are you saying, in semiconductors, in energy and build out, but as a family office, I may not have the internal teams to be a direct investor in that. Would you recommend that I go through, God forbid, a consultancy, but sometimes, or how do I get access? Do I approach, if I'm a big family office, the best players in private equity and mainly really in VC, and cut a $100 million check and try to get into what they're doing? How would you recommend that I get exposure to adapting my investment policy statement, really my allocations? Not, no one has a crystal ball. I don't know exactly how that's going to play out. You're now asking me to source and vet, trust as an LP, take on counterparty risk. Where am I wrong, and how could I make better decisions based on that framework of still me being concerned?
Yeah, certainly. And it's when these nonlinear shifts happen, a lot of things change really quickly. I mean, you could just look at software just over the last couple weeks to start this year, down, I think, over like 20% or something like that. Because when you do actually unleash innovation and the system does begin to shift, things start to shift quite quickly. And so whereas a lot of, I would say, the hedge fund industry stock picking has not been a core focus from the perspective of, if you look at like active management versus passive management, another pendulum that's swung so far, it's dramatically been in favor of passive. And because of that, valuations and things like that haven't really mattered as much, to the extent that this new system does start to play out and you do reorient where stock picking does matter, subsector picking does matter, you will likely want more active management rather than just passive. What I'm referring to here is, okay, if you just had to pick like the big ETFs to be focused on, you probably would. I think phase one of the AI build out from an infrastructure perspective is starting to get late innings, and I wouldn't be focused on those AI semiconductors. But to the extent that you could focus on analog semiconductors or other areas that are a little bit more focused to edge AI and the next, I'd be focused on that. I would be focused high level on the energy subsector. So you could talk about XLE or OIH, but then actually drill down into the specifics of the companies that are within that who actually have the exposures you want. As well as from the money perspective. So gold, and then if you want to drill into the miners, figuring those out, as well as Bitcoin and figuring out that ecosystem. It doesn't necessarily answer like the CIO's question of how much allocation should be hedge fund or something else. But in my mind, you want to be looking at hedge funds or advisors that you trust that are focused in those areas, because those are the areas that are going to receive that basically need to receive the investment and are the areas that are of growth that are critical for the hegemons. And so they are going to be focused on that. And those opportunities as the system rebalances effectively are where incremental capital flows will go. And so how you express it from like a downstream product perspective, whether it's choosing a passive ETF that happens to fit within it, or finding someone who can actually select stocks downstream within that framework, that's basically my recommendation.
And I know I'm going in areas that are maybe a little bit outside of your core focus, but you're smart. You're a first principles thinker. Let's make the assumption. I did a video a couple of nights ago. I know rarefied air, but how a $30 billion family office plus could be investing. And even if I put 2% in gold, that's, in that example, that's 600 million. And if I'm going to put money in silver, money in copper, am I directly owning it to have the most control? How do I not only buy that massive amount, how do I store it? How do I protect it? Or likely, do I have to do a combination of some physical and paper? Paper, especially in gold and silver, it's a little bit of a black box to some degree, depending on how you're getting in. And I'm just loaded, I could argue, with all sorts of maybe leverage, derivative, and effectively, broadly, because of that, counterparty risk. So if I'm a larger scale family office, and agreeing with you on your thesis and energy and commodities, which I do, but sometimes when the rubber hits the road, how you actually execute and do it, it gets messy and complicated. Would you have any recommendations for a larger scale family office that agrees to putting a higher percentage into what we're describing, how they would actually go about and do it?
Yeah, and it's a good point and a good position to be in given given the size. I think this is maybe where you can think about actual downstream ownership of companies that are producing the things that you actually want to be invested in. So, maybe you do want gold, but there's also a multiplier if you can find gold mine in a Western Hemisphere area that maybe is going to undergo a transition shift as Trump kind of enacts his Don Roe doctrine to re-solidify the Western Hemisphere. So you saw it with Argentina. Venezuela, I would say, is kind of a different one. They chose not to play by the rules, and they went more hostile from a U.S. perspective. They're done pretty surgically, whereas Malay was more of we choose to play by the rules, and they were when they ran into issues, the U.S. was the first to help them with the swap line. But in areas like that where you're starting to pay attention to, hey, let's run a scenario analysis of other resource-rich South American or Latin American broadly countries that might have been underinvested in really over the last several decades that could undergo, Brazil, for example, having an election later this year. What resources might they have? What would be useful for kind of the hegemon broadly, and thinking about the shift away from socialism in those areas towards free market capitalism and the value it unlocks. I think you could either find allocations if you just wanted to take a simpler approach towards the publicly traded equities or the index of those countries in general, or delving down deeper to say, okay, there's a copper mine here that I outright want to own, or maybe not outright own, but like own an ownership stake in with another actual management team running it. I don't think you want to manage the actual operations, but point being is getting a little bit smarter about the leverage you could get from actually owning the maybe a minority stake or even up to a majority stake of some of those types of assets that I think can be asymmetric because of their needs in the future.
I broadly agree. Even a $1 billion family that wants to go hardcore. I had Mark Faber on, the legendary economist, a couple of months ago, noting 20% broadly in commodities. that's $200 million in a billion-dollar family. Some of the same challenges that I brought up before for some of the families that I'm on the board of and others that are members that are larger scale. If you guys know a mine in some of the commodities we're talking about that's for sale, yes, I would have families that would have some level of an interest, by the way. We could argue controlling, non-controlling, co-investing. Brazil's an interesting country, very resource rich to some degree, even Mexico, but both of those countries come with some grave challenges, depending on the risk profile of a US or non-US family looking to allocate that sort of real money, let alone the operator risk, which you briefly hinted at, bring it in the right resources. Let's switch attention a little bit to the bigger picture, more economic and macro picture. You hinted at it earlier. We'll dive a little bit into tariffs. So broadly, we can make the argument that the trade deals we had, especially coming out of World War II, was very beneficial for the West, the rebuilding of Japan, and for the world. But that has changed. We could argue that Trump made a good decision to renegotiate a lot of the trade deals, and tariffs, although they could have come with some challenges, broadly speaking, we'll see what the Supreme Court does. I think it may be on the right direction for certain things. But why don't I get your perspective for a family office being down the middle and not caring either way, per se, from a political perspective, but how should they be thinking about the tariffs and what impact is that going to have on their bigger picture thinking broadly in the family they represent or the family itself within the family office? Why does this matter and what could be the impact?
Yeah, certainly. So to your point, after World War II, basically the US just dropped its tariffs on the rest of the world and enabled the productive capacity of Japan and Germany to start rebuilding it, taking more of a growth mindset. Hey, let's grow the pie. We can all be better off. Korea, Taiwan followed along that path as well. And then I would argue that the path along China, which I think we can delve into maybe a separate question on kind of the U.S.-China rivalry. But point being is tariffs had been used and have been used in the past for a multitude of reasons. I think the tariffs in this case, the initial reason for them being utilized was a shock and awe to wake people up to say, hey, the system is no longer working for the US, the architect, things are going to change. And so get people, line them up, let's have conversations at Mar-a-Lago. Again, I'm not necessarily defending one way or the other, whether how it was done is the correct way, but people were pretty deeply asleep. This is a way to wake them up. And two is this is to the point on production versus consumption. That's the pendulum that really swung so far out of bounds, particularly for critical products. So I don't think tariffs are going to remain on things that are not critical. Like I use the example of rubber ducks or toys. These things that really are products that can be manufactured anywhere, and the U.S. doesn't care. Those are just bargaining tools. The tariffs that actually matter are the ones and will likely stick for a period of time until manufacturing is reshored or friendshored, are tariffs on critical products, semiconductors, things like pharmaceuticals, things in the realm of, hey, this is a critical product area that is controlled by an adversary and represents a dependency externally that we do not control. We need to regain control of that. So that was another point of it. And I think too many people were focused on tariffs as, oh, is this a revenue mechanism or things like that. I actually think revenue is a byproduct of what the real purpose of tariffs is. And the real purpose of tariffs is basically what we were just talking about, to actually rebalance the system. And I think gradually they'll actually start to go away and the revenues will start to decrease because that is not the focus. And Besant, I think, has even said as much recently. But the broader point is to then get people back to the table and say, okay, this was to have a conversation. The path to free trade, which I actually would argue we have not had over the last several decades. China in particular has tariffs as well as some currency or manipulation basically to keep it artificially low, has basically put the system out of balance, and therefore we haven't had free or fair trade. And the path to what I would say free trade, the dropping of all tariffs as well as non-tariff barriers, is fair trade. Okay, wake up and actually see how this is all structured, see what is going on. And once you recognize, okay, this is actually what's going on, which I think is probably happening behind closed doors with those in power, we can start to remove these. Tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, to actually generate free trade. I think that is the broader vision, and you've started to see some of it with trade deals with different nations around the world. And I would just expect more of that from an intention perspective. Which, so from a family office perspective, the things I would be focused on again would be the critical products, because those tariffs are likely to remain because those things are a key focus, whereas the other ones I think are more of just like a negotiating lever and not something I think about for the next decade.
A back-to-back on tariffs, you partially answered both of them, so maybe we'll keep it a little bit succinct. China has used tariffs and industrial policy for, I don't know, decades. Now suddenly it's controversial when the US does it. We'll start there. Again, I know you partially addressed it, but again, I'm thinking as a family office, why does this matter? Why should I care?
Yeah, for sure. So that is basically when China entered the WTO and had the most favored nation clause in the early 2000s. That's what I would argue when some of the policy decisions in the U.S. They began making effectively mistakes, and those mistakes were pretty obvious by the time that President Xi came into power, when effectively at that point China stopped buying U.S. treasuries, which before that was basically to enter the system, you have to buy U.S. treasuries. And they began to funnel their surplus into productive capacity that we're exactly talking about. And so the point being is China basically exploited the system, which it was on, and in my view, it's on those in power to pay attention to that. Those are the three big things that those in power got to get right: system, pillars of power, and investing in the productive labor force. And China exploited the system. That I think that should have been obvious, basically by the, call it 2015 timeframe, when China was building out, Made in China 2025, and they've been incredibly successful in effectively focusing in on technology, energy, and money outside of basically semiconductors and semiconductor capital equipment, which I think is kind of their weak point. But the point being is the old system was effectively manipulated to actually undermine the architect in that framework. And going forward, I think it is probably unlikely that the U.S. builds out incremental productive capacity in China. But if there is a deal to be brokered, I could see something like, if China is willing to play ball and rebalance. So they have too much production, US has too much consumption. The way to rebalance that would be China potentially investing in US production, like CATL or BYD plants in the US, and starting to increase consumption rather than focusing so much on production in the domestic Chinese economy, and buying US goods or other Western goods. That's how I could see like a peaceful rebalancing occurring. But in all those situations, the focus in the Western Hemisphere or the West broadly is on increasing the production perspective.
Are tariffs, do you think, a temporary tool or a permanent feature of what we're calling the new system?
I would say temporary tool.
If you're running a family office, managing serious money, how should you position? We mentioned a little bit earlier around energy and commodities, but how does the tariff reality come into play, whether it's in cash, other currencies, short term, also back to commodities? How would you look at an adaptation to our investment policy statement, allocations portfolio, or mitigating risk?
I guess from the perspective of tariffs, I think it's more of a catalyst to change the system and think about where your exposures are and so like if you have different currency exposures in different countries, where are those countries likely to align if they were forced to choose a side, kind of US, China, and paying attention to that jurisdiction. You talked about kind of the from a legal and power perspective, the U.S. system has been the place where rule of law has kind of been. People have trusted the legal system and have been confident that they can invest and own private property in it for a long time. I'm not so sure that China it fits that bill. Personally, I would probably not allocate specifically to that, but from the perspective of thinking about tariffs, I would use it as a catalyst to reanalyze it. Think about a neutral reserve currency during this time frame. Again, that's gold. And then as we're talking about like the old system ending and the new system beginning. Usually it doesn't happen just necessarily overnight. Like I think these things are being continued and built in parallel. And until there's a clear hegemon necessarily, there's not going to be this is now a system that's being linearly optimized again, like the last 80 years. We're in this period of kind of entropy and chaos. And so taking maybe a more neutral view where you can, as you see things develop path dependently, you incrementally allocate.
And we're going to get to Greenland, Panama, and what I call strategic assets next. A little bit of just 30 seconds for the audience listening in, and would like to know a little bit of what I have upcoming, mainly more so for next week. On Tuesday, I got an incredible guest coming on for the 5th time, one of the sharpest investors I know, Ram Alawalia. I'm actually going to be on his platform leading a co-discussion for probably 2 hours. We'll see if I could switch it over as well to my platforms. Worst case, you'll get it after the fact. He's great. We're going to talk about Warsh, and I may even ask Ryan a question or two about that as well. Kind of the new proposed incoming Fed chair, the weaponization of the dollar, stable coins, the impact on Iran, and lots of different subjects around AI. We're also going to break down for a $1 billion to $10 billion and my legendary $30 billion plus families, what some allocations could look like, and kind of the things we're talking about today that we're in a new system. The day after that, Wednesday, we have on Jimmy Sexton, an American who for many years is a tax strategist and attorney by trade based out of United Arab Emirates, mainly Dubai, a little bit more for non-US families, but US families will get value out of it. And we're going to go hardcore and deep on that. So a great week upcoming next week. Ryan, a question for you, as I hinted at about a minute ago. We'll begin with Greenland. I haven't followed it quite as closely since Davos wrapped up about 2 weeks ago. But in talking about Greenland, so I'm assuming everyone thinks that Trump's crazy for even mentioning it in the way that he did and possibly wanted it to be a U.S. asset in another state. But you look at systems. Let's ignore the volatility, the talk. Why does Greenland actually matter strategically?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think Greenland fits within the broader Arctic, which in my view is one of 2 incrementally important spheres. So the Arctic space, and over the last, call it 80 years, the main bottleneck has been the ocean, and that was primarily controlled by the U.S. Navy. And the Arctic starts to basically pose a new opportunity for both trade routes, resources, and as you're thinking about control over the new system, you have to make sure that you have different basically technologies to handle all of those. So the ocean ships, Arctic. If you look at Russia's nuclear icebreakers, they have, I think, 9 or something like that. Whereas I don't know if the U.S. even has 1 at this point. But point being is the Arctic is another kind of sphere in this broader Cold War 2.0. And so as is space. Greenland happens to be a resource-rich place that sits in the Arctic, and tying this a bit to the space aspect is back right before Russia invaded Ukraine, you saw cords, undersea cables cut in Svalbard, which is in the north in the Arctic, and those are the main communication point for basically internet access, as well as, in particular, military communications are quite important for that. And the Arctic happens to be that spot that doesn't spin and is perfect for satellites to kind of reconnect. Pippa Malmgren is very good on this. But
Yes.
point being is Greenland is right there, kind of next to it, is resource rich, and is an area where if you are able to, ice begins to melt, you're able to start to traverse that, and that opens up a gap. I forget the name of that gap right there. That is another thing that you need to be paying attention to for undersea nuclear. And so there's a lot of strategic rationale from a hegemon who wants to control that. Frankly, the U.S. already has a lot of military control over that. So I think the reason it was brought up in Davos was kind of to suck the oxygen out of the room, frankly, and just talk about something that he wasn't going to do. I mean, invading a NATO country is not something that I think was on the bingo card, but broader point being is the Arctic is a massive sphere of influence that I think is critical, and as is Canada, Greenland right next to Canada. And if you want to build the Golden Dome, which my view is this is about to come into the spotlight as space comes into the spotlight, because the Golden Dome is basically something that is built in space and will require a lot of infrastructure in the Arctic. You're going to want Canada and Greenland on the same page to actually build that infrastructure to effectively deter adversaries from military attack. So broader point, there's a lot of different realms, and you can look at it from, I look at everything from a pillars of power framework. So like, what does Greenland have from a technology, energy, and money perspective? And it enables technology. It has resources from an energy perspective, particularly thinking about critical rare earth minerals for solar and things like that, as well as batteries. And from a money perspective, it opens up a new trade route, and thinking about how control over that will affect kind of the new system. So a lot is
a lot indeed. And actually, you kind of answered my following two questions on Greenland, but in case there's nuance you want to add to it, why not? It's in my head, I'll ask it. So you mentioned like really three things where Greenland's very valuable, from rare earth minerals to Arctic access to simply strategic positioning. You do think of things through a pillars of power that you mentioned several times, including a couple of seconds ago. Which pillar, how about that? Which pillar does Greenland most directly impact, in your opinion?
Probably technology, because of how important space is to everything. So if you think about the connection point from if you think about the connection point, like I was referring to, was Svalbard, that was kind of a critical choke point. So my view is they're probably going to build more of those, so it's resilient, and there isn't just one kind of choke point from that perspective. There are others already, but building out from that. And if you're going to build the Golden Dome, you need Greenland within that, and the Golden Dome, in my view, is kind of the key enablement from a technology perspective.
And you mentioned kind of several new spheres, if I got them correctly: Arctic, space, ocean. Greenland definitely fits into the Arctic strategic picture. And you actually reached out to me, and one of the reasons why you're on now. So I encourage people to reach out to me. When earlier this month I had on Michael Irish, we went pretty deep into space and space tech, and how that also is an opportunity from multiple strategic points for the US, the Western world, but for family offices and the future of investing as well. Anything specific as we maybe put a bow on Greenland that you would like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I guess as you're thinking about infrastructure as well, there's going to be a lot of probably infrastructure opportunities there. Data centers make a lot of sense in the cold because power is 30-40% of the cost, and if it's cold, like that's a way to reduce that cost. There's also the data centers in space, which there's technological studies here and there. I don't think it's going to be something that's immediate, but an opportunity down the road. And thinking about those spheres again, like from an investing perspective, in my mind, you always look for, all right, what is the bottleneck, and focus on kind of investing there until it doesn't become a bottleneck. I think the Arctic and building out space-related infrastructure are going to be two spheres that are like the equivalent of the U.S. moving west, the old world discovering the new world. These are huge opportunities, and the ocean, again, that has been a sphere of control that has been very important, but underwater submersibles is something that I think from a military perspective, unmanned underwater submersibles are an area that to pay attention to, and technologies around that.
Going a little bit back to our hemisphere, the Dunroad doctrine that you noted, the Panama Canal, I guess, well, it's back in the conversation. Are we seeing a broader strategy around controlling strategic choke points and assets? This may also allow you to dive in. We hinted at it earlier, mentioned a country like Brazil. I mentioned Mexico, some of the angst with the US, our relationship with Malay and Argentina, political elections coming up where maybe things are going to lean a little bit more democratic and to the right, for lack of a better word. So there's a lot going on in our own hemisphere. Trump definitely has a different, far more aggressive perspective than a Biden and effectively every other president I could think of in relatively modern times. How do you think this could all play out? He's taking some risk here, but I can make the argument they're very strategic and may be the right call. What do you think? And again, taking it back to why should family offices care?
Yeah, it is absolutely a strategic choke point, and it was controlled directly by China, actually.
Yes.
So I think the what people maybe didn't realize is how much China had invested in the Western Hemisphere over the last decade in particular. So I alluded to it a little bit before with they stopped recycling their excess dollars into U.S. Treasuries, which in my mind was kind of a signal of not abiding by the system, and started recycling it into the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as building out influence in the Western Hemisphere, including control over Panama, as well as a lot of assets within Venezuela and other areas in LATAM. And so the refocusing on controlling the Western Hemisphere, I think, is going to be absolutely a focus for whether it's this president or the next. I think it's similar to how Trump brought China into the collective consciousness in his first term, and Biden continued it without, maybe not as much deterrence, but he was still kept a lot of those policies in place. I think something like the Western Hemisphere, maybe done in a different way, will be a critical focus area, and therefore, in my view, is it's a focus area where, unlike prior regime change efforts that the U.S. has implemented in, maybe the Middle East, the Venezuela one, I think, kind of sets a template where they did it with, I think, limited casualties. I don't know all the specifics, but it was basically in, out, just had Maduro, and then the number two who agreed to basically play by the system rules took charge rather than someone being put in place or otherwise. Things like that, I think, are likely on the horizon, to an extreme of, if you don't play by the rules, this is what it could be. If you do play by the rules, Malay is like an example kind of on the other end of the spectrum. And there's plenty of countries that have elections over the coming year and years that they kind of see their options and they say, okay, well, free market capitalism, Argentina is now growing, looking a lot better. That's been a great investment. Thinking about what is kind of the next Argentina is an opportunity for family offices, because I think that re-solidifying that foundation of the Western Hemisphere is unequivocally going to continue.
You did mention a couple of times, perhaps I should have led an hour ago with this question, but it's never too late. Explain your pillars of power framework: technology, energy, and money, and why those three specifically.
Yeah, I have alluded to them a lot, and probably I should have just explained. But when you actually look at history, the hegemon that actually controls the system tends to have leadership in all three of those areas, and this goes back from the U.S. now, Britain before, the Dutch before, and it's always just to use the U.S. as an example, you technology, you tend to have asymmetric technology. So not just technology that your peer has, but yours is a little bit better, but rather something that is so superior that it provides you the ability to both deter as well as like end wars. So the atomic bomb is kind of an example coming out of World War II, as well as the US had a formidable fleet of aircraft carriers and so on. And you can look back in history when the Portuguese and Spanish came to the New World. They had guns. Other people already here did not. That is basically just kind of using an example of asymmetry in terms of the technology. So the first pillar is technology, and the military power kind of comes downstream of that. And what you always want in terms of a hegemon is to have the productive capacity to actually produce that technology at scale. So shipbuilding capabilities in the case of kind of the World War II, as we shift into the Cold War, that turned into the semiconductors and precision technology. And as we're shifting today, in my view, it's, you do need access and control over semiconductors. So Taiwan is something that's currently a hot topic. That's a foundational input into then, AI tech, AI drone tech, AI underwater submersibles, all of those things that can be powered autonomously. So you need to have that full AI tech stack as kind of the AI, is kind of the asymmetric technology, productive capacity to power it, productive capacity to build it, energy to power it. So from the perspective of cheap, abundant, reliable energy, exiting World War II, the U.S. had that asymmetric technology, and they were completely energy independent. That's fluctuated over time, and those periods of time where the U.S. was not energy independent, the system was exploited, notably in the 70s. And then money. In my view, if you have that asymmetric technology, you get to dictate the money. And so in this case, we've been utilizing the US dollar as the reserve currency, US treasuries effectively as the reserve asset. And if you're thinking we are entering a system of or a period of volatility and or the debasement trade, which really has been going on for decades, you want to own gold as that kind of neutral as well as Bitcoin. So long story short, the power over asymmetric technology, which is really kind of the focus of my background, powered by energy, enables you control over money. And then when you have control over money, that gives you incrementally more power over the system as well. So think about the SWIFT system, or the ability to have the reserve currency and reserve asset, and how that impacts your borrowing costs and things like that. And so long story short, they're basically a self-reinforcing feedback loop that enables power. And with power, you have control over the system. And so those in power at a hegemon level, or really at any level, should be thinking about how do we invest to strengthen our own pillars of power, because we want to reduce dependencies upon external areas and external, adversaries or otherwise. And that's kind of a framework that I look at for analyzing the system, but also I use it as a portfolio framework. And frankly, that's actually how it was initially built.
A follow-up question on the money pillar. We are the world reserve currency, meaning the dollar. Is dollar dominance, we could redefine that word dominance, ending, evolving? The impact of the Genius Act and stablecoins may be brilliance by the administration, probably mainly Besant. So again, is it ending, evolving, or being reinforced through the transition?
I don't think it's ending. I think the decisions over the last 20 years did as much as they could to weaken the money pillar as possible. And so had we not done something, I think it would have ended, or at least, been dramatically different than what it can be. But I think the embrace of blockchain is certainly another technological revolution that has it's another technology that has happened that you can utilize. And what I think is likely to happen is with the Genius Act and with the idea of stable coins, rather than having the world reserve currency and world reserve asset be effectively the same, you can make the currency something that is yieldless and then separate it with the reserve asset. And so you put that in if you want to invest in something that has yield. And so you separate the medium of exchange versus the store of value function, which is possible with that. And it also, from the perspective of if everyone is going to opt into what I call this new system that the US is helping orchestrate, they will utilize the US stablecoins, probably the private market ones, but given, we've seen Tether and USDC basically consult with the government. And I think private things tend to be better built given the alignment of incentives. But it's an opportunity to then, like I was saying before, if you are then saying all of that money that is then created then flows back to buying treasury bills, in that case for the yield for the reserve asset, you have the opportunity to fund yourself. And this gives you better, control, which control in the wrong hands is dangerous. So, I have some concern around that, depending upon how this evolves over the next decade, meaning like controlling the currency and influencing how people make decisions, but also it brings into light the otherwise offshore dollar system that they had no control or really visibility of, which is in the trillions of dollars that was created. Now, if you theoretically bring that and funnel it through the stablecoin system, I think it's a whole ability to give you visibility as well as control and funding to the point. So
the conversation around money, I think, is going to be important. It's going to be a deeper dive for me and Ram Alawalia next week. But I will ask you, Powell as the current Fed chair, a proposed incoming is going to be Warsh, who's a hawk. Do you have a specific opinion how family offices could think about that, a likely transition, and the impact on interest rates and how they're investing?
Yeah, I think Warsh fits the bill of the broader Mar-a-Lago Accord, which I think is ongoing. Actually, I think the first 2 years of the Trump presidency will be the Mar-a-Lago Accord, starting with tariffs. You've mentioned the Genius Bill. You've seen SLR reforms to enable banks to hold more treasuries. You're probably going to get the Digital Market Clarity Act to give you some more information around that aspect of things, the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which people haven't really talked about lately, but in my mind, there's an opportunity to revalue gold just to the market, and all of a sudden you have a big balance in your TGA. So all of these things, I think, collectively kind of fit within the broader Mar-a-Lago Accord that I think is ongoing and part of the Trump admin agenda. And if you look at Warsh, I wouldn't necessarily say he is a hawk in the sense of, I guess my view of what he is going to likely be focused on is, one, the Trump admin is very deeply focused on utilizing technology for both productivity and national security. And I don't think that productivity gains will be viewed as something that he needs to stifle out. So from that perspective, I wouldn't expect rate hikes just because there's growth driven by productivity, which is a positive from a tech cycle investment perspective. I think he is less likely to, I guess, make the mistakes of the prior QE, where QE initially, I think, is necessary to save the system that is seizing, but extended for durations of decade plus create serious distortions. If you look at how he views it, he wants more money creation to be decentralized, not centralized. And so re-giving power to regional banks in particular, as well, to actually lend to the productive economy, I think is going to be a big focus. And to do that, I think rate cuts are likely, particularly when you actually look at the US government's interest bill, which is over 1.1 trillion, bigger than defense. Rate cuts and refinancing at the short end while you're fixing the foundation are a viable strategy to reduce effectively your interest expense, and that capital is basically going to unproductive use. So I guess long story short is I think Warsh is playing into the exact agenda of focusing on letting AI and productivity continue, kind of similar to how I think Greenspan viewed it in the 90s, and paying attention to how the system is creating capital, ideally less kind of at the public centralized level and more at the private dispersed level, to realign incentives.
Maybe my words in your mouth, but you stated, I believe, at least in your writings, the technology race among that technology, energy, and money in your four pillars, or your pillars, I'm sorry. You say the technology race is the race that controls kind of the global world order, and everything else will flow from there. Kind of a bold claim. Pardon the bluntness of my following question. Prove it. Why?
Yeah. So if you actually look through history, most hegemonic shifts actually occur at technological revolutions. And this is because the hegemon tends to get asymmetric technology advantage coming out of it. And so prior, Britain, if you look at the first industrial revolution, they were effectively the leader. And that, because of the productivity as well as the asymmetry that you can use from a military perspective, just creates such an influx of capability that people are not necessarily able, but other countries are not necessarily able to keep up with the capabilities. You still need the energy to power it and money to fund it, but what you do tend to also see is the biggest technological revolutions tend to happen coinciding with shifts in energy revolutions as well. So thinking about before, like the Portuguese and wind power for their boats, but then you shifted towards steamboats, and then you started to shift towards coal-powered railroads and systems like that. And then we had automobiles and oil. And now today, we're thinking about AI and solar power as kind of the potential shift. Again, I think if you look at energy consumption over time, it actually just keeps going up. And so each builds upon the next. But that incremental source of lower cost energy is a key thing. And so today, talking about the hegemon, so the US displayed clear asymmetric technology, and exiting World War II reinforced it to basically end the Cold War with precision technology enabled by semiconductors. And now today, I don't think either side, China or the US, has asymmetric technology. And that is why it is the race to establish the next system. And in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of back and forth. China has rare earth refining capabilities that the West is, does not have effectively. And that is a key input into everything we're talking about from the asymmetric technology perspective. Whereas China does not have semiconductors or semiconductor capital equipment capabilities on the on the order of the West. And I think those are kind of like the two big things. And if you actually look at the deals between the two, the US and China have effectively agreed to exchange those things while they're figuring out what's happening. So in my mind, those are like kind of the two choke points on either side. And hopefully communication channels continue while this race, I don't think it stayed cold from the Russia-Ukraine, it's pretty obvious, but the US-China hopefully doesn't escalate to that level, and it stays kind of Cold War with different displays of the asymmetric technology over time. Like, I think that's part of the reason for the Genesis project, which the Trump administration unveiled, I think maybe a month or so ago, which is basically focused on connecting all of the institutions into an AI network in the US to basically enable something on the order of the Manhattan Project or better. And broader point is the technology allows you to do things and assert control, and I think you'll see more displays of it, like the Maduro display, where in out took the leader, no real issues of that magnitude that sends signals to your adversary.
Of course. And a good segue into effectively AI and technology, and we would call it kind of Cold War 2.0. We're going to have a little under 15 minutes. I probably have 6 or 7 questions applicable to me as well. We're probably going to go a little bit rapid fire. Here we go. So you call this the Cold War 2.0. What makes the AI race fundamentally different than the original Cold War?
Well, I guess the technology that's being utilized, the original Cold War, I think the US at that point still had pretty asymmetric technology. The money pillar was not an issue back then. Debt to GDP was 30%. Energy, I would argue they were actually a little bit weaker than they are today. So the energy pillar might be strengthened relative to the original Cold War. And that was when the Soviet Union exposed the US's energy pillar in the 1970s. And that's, caused inflation, and they had to reinforce the money pillar by raising rates, which still worked because most capital was created by banks. And then technology at that point was a race, but the US basically won it with semiconductors. The creation of semiconductors in Silicon Valley, funded by DARPA, allowed precision technology and ended it. Today, my point is I don't see that asymmetry that makes it so obvious, but that's why the US is so heavily investing in AI, and China and the US are taking kind of different approaches to AI as well.
So semiconductors are the foundation of AI. Taiwan makes by far the most voluminous and advanced chips. How fragile is that system, and what happens if that changes?
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to have a multi-pronged approach, in my view, of in parallel, you're reshoring semiconductor manufacturing. So TSMC has announced incrementally more fabrication facilities that are coming to the US, and the faster they can do that, the better. That's a people and productive capacity question more than it is a money question. They're putting plenty towards it. Meanwhile, still having open communication channels with China and trying to deter any sort of takeover of Taiwan before you're effectively ready. So I think it's a choke point that has been built up over the last decade in particular that is something that is critical to defend, particularly in the short term, or critical to deter, particularly in the short term. And ideally, you can come to an amenable decision where the US and China agree to something where maybe Taiwan does reunify, but it's a decade out. And so there's some kind of transition period to allow it. Because yes, 90% plus of high-end, basically leading edge, so call it 3 nanometer less, are produced in Taiwan, and you're changing it as fast as you can, but it's a choke point.
And speaking of choke points, so traditional choke points, things like the Suez Canal, what are the choke points in things like space in the Arctic?
Yeah, those are good questions. I think Svalbard was an example of one. I think Greenland and owning that is an example of one in the Arctic. And those then also tie into space, because those are the points at which the communications come down and then are distributed. And so the build out of the Golden Dome, I think, is kind of a deterrence thing and will be focused on the Arctic, but also the build out of space-based infrastructure, which I would argue the U.S. is in the lead with SpaceX at the helm. And if you just look at Russia and Ukraine as an example, if Ukraine was not given access to Starlink satellites, that war would have ended very quickly, with Russia basically taking over the country quite quickly. But because their other satellites were jammed, Starlink and the technology they've built up, I think from a space perspective, are superior to what the Chinese have built thus far. And I think you're going to see more acts of kind of displays of power. We're going back to the moon, for example, building out things like a lunar base to think about what resources are there as a base to then propel and explore other parts of space. Similar to the Arctic, space is dense in terms of technological capabilities as well as resources, and being able to actually get to space and build out that infrastructure is a critical step one.
And I'm thinking about, again, investing in how family offices could think. When we talk about things like space, the Arctic, even the ocean floor, I mean, these are frontiers that require a massive capital, arguably, maybe not as much today, we'll see, but decades long timelines. I want to be a long-term investor. True, big families should have 100-year plans. The planning is more valuable than the actual plan itself, but besides the point. But how do I invest in things that may not pay off for, maybe decades? Or am I wrong? Why?
I think that given how quickly tech moves, these frontiers will be investable sooner. You might even see a SpaceX IPO this year, or we'll see how that's handled from an Elon perspective. But thinking about it from, okay, if you believe in these frontiers, what are the things that are going to enable that exploration is a more immediate ability, a more immediate investable category. So thinking about how do you actually get to space? What are the companies that build or supply into Starlink satellites or the Starship from SpaceX? Thinking about shipbuilding capabilities and who are the companies that will allow you to explore the Arctic, nuclear icebreakers and things like that. So I think we're more at the enablement phase than the phase of hey, we're asteroid mining and we should own that. If you are thinking out in decades, those are types of probably private projects that you can think about. But if you're thinking about what can I invest in now that should see its TAM continue to expand because it's a focus area, I would focus on that enabling layer.
And so one of your businesses is CrowdCent. As I remember, it's a model that uses AI to select human-generated investment ideas. Why does that work better than either humans or machines alone?
Yeah, and this is actually a good point of where I think we are in AI as well. I don't think we're at AGI where humans are going to be completely replaced. I think that actually probably requires a foundationally different approach. But I think we're more at IA, which is intelligence augmentation, where the capabilities that the people who are utilizing what we call AI are enhanced dramatically. And so when you pair kind of a human who has this unique creative capability that the AI effectively doesn't have. The AI is trained on only things that are on the internet, a lot of which is junk. It is able to filter down because of all of these different parameter optimizations and things like that. So it's obviously gotten quite good as a tool, particularly to replace rote tasks that are repetitive. But in terms of like creating novel ideas, I don't think it is there yet. And I actually think it probably requires a different approach. So when you pair the human who has novel creative ideas and layer on a system on top that can systematically analyze all of the ideas ever posted, knows how they did those ideas performance-wise relative to an index, and doesn't have bias, which, obviously a lot of discretionary investing comes down to trying to remove your biases. The pairing of that kind of creativity with the power of the machine leads to generally better results.
And another question I probably should have started off with an hour and a half ago, but again, it's never too late because it's in my title, and that's first principles. Both you and I are advocates of it. The work I do with single family offices, do I like benchmarking and best practices? Sure. But being a devotee of Peter Drucker and new principles from incredible entrepreneurs like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos shows the importance of things are changing. I need to break things down to their barest essence. How does an underlying principles of first principles, what does that mean to you? And does that apply to practically everything from a business and investing perspective?
Yeah, I from my mind, I always am asking the why until I understand how things function. That's why when I see people kind of talking past each other today, in particular around symptoms, when they're talking about wealth concentration, all of these things, and they don't actually get to the root of why some of these things happen, it frustrates me. And so I want people to understand kind of the why and the how underlying things, so you can actually fix the root issues and address the root issues and build on top of a stronger foundation. And I mean, you laid out some of the best in terms of building businesses around it. Elon just saying, okay, why is it done this way? Why? Getting back to the first principles of, okay, this is what we want to do. How do we do it? Building from the first blocks. That's basically how I try to analyze everything, whether it is building a business, but also just kind of thinking through systems as well as technologies and kind of where they're going.
Probably two final questions. Looking at the next decade, what are the 2 or 3 biggest opportunities? And maybe we touched on them a little bit earlier, but that people maybe are completely missing.
Completely missing. I don't know that I have anything that people are completely missing. I think pulling things together from a lot of different sources is something that I pride myself on, trying to take an active, open mind and seeing, I can utilize Dalio's debt cycle, but maybe you don't listen to him for this, and you focus on Carlota Perez for technological revolutions, all being able to put it together in terms of kind of that meta layer that sits on top of a lot of these cycles. And in looking at that, what I drill down to in terms of, okay, we talked about the system and how it might change, and then you go all the way down the filter of, okay, that's the production focus, pillars of power focus, and getting all the way to the bottom. I think owning the kind of productive assets of those like core components is a key one, as well as the investment in understanding how to use IA or AI in a way that gives you incremental agency. I think it's never been a better time to actually be able to do that in a way to actually turn what is in your mind from a creative perspective into not just an idea, but an actual product.
But your final question, if you're wrong, and I don't think you're wrong, but maybe timelines could be off. But if you are wrong or timeline off regarding this system transition, is there a clear signal that you missed the call?
I think what we'll likely see over the coming years is this evolution of Cold War 2.0, and hopefully it stays cold. Something that would be, I guess, clearly wrong would be um, uh, something from the perspective of the Mar-a-Lago Accord type that I think has been kind of playing out over this time frame doesn't happen, and they continue to kind of perpetuate the consumption side of things, or someone else comes into power and reverts towards the old system even though it exacerbates issues. I think those are observable outputs to say, okay, like timelines have changed, but given my view of kind of the system analysis and the entropy that has been building up, I think things are going to change. I don't necessarily think everyone knows how they're going to change. And so it becomes incredibly important to be path dependent upon what happens. Like, does China take Taiwan? Does China display asymmetric tech? Does the US display asymmetric tech? These are all things. And I think the pillars of power framework, in my mind, helps keep the noise out and just focus on the things that really matter.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan. I appreciate you reaching out proactively. Like, one person who watches some of my interviews, and he was kind enough to reach out, was very impressed by him, and look forward to continuing our relationship, having you in a little bit of my circle of relationships that I think families and family offices would benefit from, my dream team, so to speak. As we're wrapping up, and I give my close in a second, although I did mention one of your companies and what you guys do, maybe give the audience a minute or 90 seconds, a little bit of your background, the companies that you're a founder or co-founder of, and lastly, how to follow you on social media or reach out to you to want to connect and learn more. How could they do so?
Yeah, for sure. So quickly on my background, kind of started in the investment banking, shifted to focusing directly on semiconductors, and moved to the buy side to invest directly into semiconductors, moving all the way up towards an investment management role where I ran a fund. Founded CrowdCent to basically pair AI with human creativity to build a machine learning layer that selects stocks systematically. So if that is something that you're interested in, kind of the blend of those two, feel free to reach out to me at ryan@crowdcent.com. And then I also have another business, which is the AquaVis Advisors, which a lot of the input into that machine learning layer for CrowdCent, that knowledge kind of goes into it. But this is a separate thing that is focused on content to both make people aware of all of the system and different things, and then there's tiers above it to actually drill down into some of those more specific companies that flow through our process to actually be able to invest. And you can reach out to me at ryan@aquavisadvisors.com for that, or at AquaVisX, I believe is the handle there. And CrowdCent's handle, I think, is at CrowdCent. So all of those are viable ways to reach out, and certainly happy to have been on your show. Thank you for the invite. And if anyone has questions or otherwise, happy to answer them, and would love to continue the relationship. Absolutely.
Of course. And that's Ryan Mahon, Mahon. Ryan, it's been great to get to know you a bit in the last month. Look forward to hopefully meeting you in the near future and be in a relationship for hopefully a long time to come. My members, by the way, you simply just have to send me a note, and I'm happy to make a direct connection. To 99% of my guests, Ryan would certainly be one that would be of value and enjoy the connection. And hopefully at an upcoming event this year, we'll have Ryan and other first principle, technology-driven deep thinkers, thought leaders, investors that are a part of our programs. So everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. You could follow me on LinkedIn and YouTube. I'm at Family Office on YouTube, like Ryan did and reached out, and I greatly appreciate it. I've been in the family office community, too long, too many decades, but I do love it. And these conversations never get old to me. I learn so much. And the sad part is, even an hour and 35, hour and 40 minutes, well, for me, because I'm a curiosity and just junkie for information, it's just never long enough, which motivates me to, in 6 to 8 months, want to have Ryan back, because there's going to be so much, as there always is, in terms of talking about. If you would enjoy more of a direct connection to my community, being part of our intelligence and strategy community with I mean, come on, you get my 700-page handbook on creating a top 1% family office. You get my family office playbook with 850 questions. All my long form content in writing will put some of you to sleep, but there's some great insights there. Proprietary interviews, videos, and most importantly, are among the big two. Invites to my private events, like my 4 days upcoming in Palm Beach, and effectively direct connection to me. Not that I'm so awesome and great, but hopefully I learned a thing or two, but I know so many incredible people that could solve or help you get in the right direction anywhere around the world on practically you name the issue: tax, legal, cyber, a risk issue. I've had people that needed to hire like a head of their multiple households and needed a right connection for that. I try to help my members in any way that I could. And after 20 years in the industry and traveling the world, I hope my Rolodex it should be halfway decent at this point. So go to angelorobles.com and learn more and be a part of it. My upcoming event is over 4 days, and some of it's social. It's not all content. We got to have some drinks, cigars, and good food as well. That's March 16th through 19th in beautiful Palm Beach. After that, we'll be around the Milken in LA in early May, and other things in Newport and Hamptons this summer, New York City later in the year, Vienna. I'm hopeful of Dubai. That'll be exciting. Again, I got a guest coming up next week that is based from there, and that's going to be a lot of fun. So next week's going to be great with the interviews. We're so fortunate to have Ryan on today. Go to angelorobles.com and just join. Make your life simple and let me work and provide value to you. And then I'll see you over 4 days with incredible peers, some of the greatest investors on earth and family offices. We're so fortunate with some of the people attending that are members and relationships of mine. And that's effectively all up at angelorobles.com. And you could reach out to me directly at my email, angelo@angelorobles.com. And I enjoy providing my content, my longer form interviews, my solos to many of you. I hope you appreciate it. Even if there's just one thing you learn or causes you to think, over the course of the year, I probably have did my service. So I greatly appreciate that. And Ryan, it's been incredible having you on. I've been nothing but impressed by you. I appreciate the way that I'm a long form talker in interviews. Ryan gives some of the most detailed, complex emails, and I love it. A guy my age, I eat up reading, and it's valuable to me. So I do appreciate it greatly. Thank you so much. Thank the audience, my members. I love you all. Thank you all so much, and have a great day.
Thanks, Angelo. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for joining.